In the sweltering heat of July 1518, a lone woman stepped into the narrow cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, her feet moving in a frantic rhythm she couldn't control. This wasn't a celebration or a performance. It was the beginning of a deadly epidemic where hundreds would dance themselves to the brink of death, their bodies betraying them in ways that defied reason. What started as one person's inexplicable compulsion would soon engulf an entire city, forcing authorities into desperate measures and leaving historians centuries later to unravel a mystery that blurred the lines between body and mind. Strasbourg, nestled along the Rhine in the Holy Roman Empire, was no stranger to hardship. The early 16th century had battered its people with relentless calamities. Famines that left bellies empty, floods that ruined crops, and outbreaks of smallpox and syphilis that claimed lives without mercy. Superstition ran deep in this devout Catholic region, where saints were invoked for protection and curses feared as divine wrath. Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers and epileptics, loomed large in local lore. It was said he could punish sinners by compelling them to dance uncontrollably until they repented or perished. Against this backdrop of despair and devotion, the unthinkable began on July 14, when Frau Trophäa, an ordinary resident whose life until then had been unremarkable, emerged from her home and started to jig erratically in the street. At first, passers-by might have dismissed it as a quirk or a momentary fit, but Frau Trophäa didn't stop. Hour after hour, her movements grew more frenzied, arms flailing, legs stomping, body twisting in spasms that looked like a grotesque parody of joy. There was no music to guide her, no partner to join in. This was involuntary, a force seizing her limbs against her will. She danced through the day and into the night, collapsing only when exhaustion overtook her, her feet swelling and bleeding from the relentless pounding on the hard ground. Witnesses described her eyes as vacant, her face expressionless, as if her mind had detached from the chaos her body endured. Her husband pleaded with her to rest, but as soon as she regained a sliver of strength, the dancing resumed, pulling her back into the street like an invisible puppeteer. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Neighbors whispered about curses or possession, their fears amplified by the recent hardships that had already stretched the city's spirit to breaking point. By the end of the first week, Frau Trophäa was no longer alone. More than 30 others had joined her, their bodies succumbing to the same uncontrollable urge. Men, women, even children, ordinary folk from bakers to laborers stepped into the fray, their dances marked by convulsions, violent thrashing, and cries of anguish. They weren't choosing this. It was as if a contagion had leaped from one to another, invisible yet unstoppable. The streets, usually alive with trade and chatter, now echoed with the shuffling of feet and the gasps of the afflicted, drawing crowds who watched in horrified fascination. As the numbers swelled, the city council could no longer ignore the growing chaos. Physicians were summoned, their diagnoses rooted in the humoral theories of the time. They declared it a case of hot blood, an overheating of the vital fluids that could only be cooled by expending the excess energy through more dancing. In a decision that would haunt the annals of history, the authorities embraced this logic. They cleared guild halls to serve as makeshift dance floors, hired musicians to provide accompaniment, and even brought in sturdy assistants to prop up the weakening dancers. The idea was simple: let them dance it out until the affliction burned itself away. But instead of relief, this intervention fueled the fire. By August, the epidemic had exploded. Up to 400 people were now caught in the grip of the mania, their numbers peaking as the summer heat intensified. The halls overflowed with bodies in motion, sweating profusely, feet raw and bloodied, hearts racing toward collapse. Some danced for days without food or water, their screams piercing the air as they begged for mercy. Reports from the time paint a scene of utter bedlam, dancers foaming at the mouth, their limbs jerking in unnatural angles, collapsing only to rise again as if compelled by an unseen force. The death toll began to mount. Exhaustion claimed lives through strokes, heart attacks, and sheer physical breakdown. At its height, chronicles suggest as many as 15 people perished each day, their bodies finally still after days of torment. Families watched helplessly as loved ones danced toward oblivion, the air thick with the stench of sweat and despair. The council's plan had backfired spectacularly. What was meant to cure only amplified the spread, turning isolated incidents into a citywide spectacle. Panic set in among the unaffected, who feared the curse might strike them next. Religious leaders stepped forward, interpreting the plague as divine punishment, perhaps the wrath of Saint Vitus himself, angered by the sins of the people. Sermons from the cathedral echoed warnings of moral decay, urging repentance. In a drastic shift, the authorities reversed course. They banned music and public dancing, fining anyone who dared indulge. But the afflicted couldn't comply, their bodies refused to obey. Desperation led to a pilgrimage. The remaining dancers were rounded up and transported to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Saverne, a mountaintop sanctuary where rituals awaited. There, priests performed exorcism-like ceremonies. The dancers were fitted with red shoes sprinkled with holy water, adorned with painted crosses, and made to grasp small crucifixes while incense wafted and Latin incantations filled the air. They were led around an altar, their steps gradually slowing as if the saint's intercession lifted the curse. By early September, the mania began to wane. One by one, the dancers stopped, their bodies finally at rest. The epidemic that had gripped Strasbourg for nearly 2 months faded as mysteriously as it had arrived, leaving behind the trail of exhaustion, grief, and unanswered questions. Centuries later, this event, documented in physician notes, city council records, and regional chronicles, continues to intrigue. What could cause hundreds to dance uncontrollably, some to their deaths? Early explanations pointed to the supernatural, demonic possession, or overheated blood, reflecting the era's blend of medicine and mysticism. But modern scholars have delved deeper, piecing together clues from history and science. One prominent theory traces the plague to ergot poisoning, a toxic fungus that infects rye, the staple grain in Strasbourg's bread. Ergot contains compounds akin to LSD, capable of inducing hallucinations, convulsions, and muscle spasms, symptoms eerily similar to those described. The region's damp climate that year could have fostered the fungus, and ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire, had plagued Europe before, causing gangrene and delirium. Proponents argue it explains its sudden onset and physical manifestations, linking it to other historical enigmas like the Salem witch trials. Yet doubts linger. If ergot was the culprit, why didn't it affect everyone who ate the contaminated bread? And how could victims, racked by such poison, sustain dancing for days without immediate collapse? Historian John Waller, after examining contemporary accounts, contends that ergotism typically leads to immobility or death from gangrene, not prolonged rhythmic movement. Moreover, the outbreak's geography doesn't align perfectly. Similar events dotted the Rhine Valley, but crops varied, and no widespread reports of gangrenous ergotism surfaced that summer. This leads to the most compelling explanation: mass psychogenic illness, a collective hysteria triggered by extreme stress. Strasbourg in 1518 was a powder keg of anxiety. Economic ruin from poor harvests, the constant threat of disease, and a cultural belief in saints' punitive powers created fertile ground for psychological contagion. Waller suggests that Frau Troffea's initial fit, perhaps sparked by personal distress, spread through suggestion and imitation, amplified by the community's shared fears. The mind, under duress, can manifest physical symptoms, involuntary movements, dissociation, even epidemic-like spread among the vulnerable. This wasn't unique. 7 other dancing manias had struck the region in prior centuries, each amid similar crises. Other ideas have surfaced, like sociologist Robert Bartholomew's notion that the dancers were heretical sect members seeking divine ecstasy through ritual. But evidence is thin. Chronicles describe the dancing as tormented, not voluntary or joyful. Neurological disorders or infectious diseases have been floated, but none fit the rapid, selective spread and sudden resolution. In the end, the dancing plague reveals the fragility of the human psyche under pressure. What began with one woman's uncontrollable steps escalated into a communal nightmare, eased only by faith and time. It echoes through history as a reminder of how stress and belief can turn minds against bodies, creating epidemics that defy easy explanation. The streets of Strasbourg fell silent once more, but the dance of 1518 lingers, a step away from understanding the depths of our collective vulnerability.